Hey folks, this is Captain Bill Toti, and I'm coming to you today in this public service announcement on a matter only tangentially related to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. You know, Seth and I love doing this podcast. We love telling stories of great World War II heroes, American and allies, and as I record this in mid-November 2024, we actually see no end in sight. We plan on continuing this podcast for the foreseeable future. But what I want to talk to you about today is even more important than that. While neither of us make our faith a topic of conversation in the podcast, Seth is a Catholic and I'm an evangelical, I wanted to reach out to make a few points related to the state of affairs for veterans across America. You see, I woke up this morning to an article that says that veteran suicides were up again in 2023. So I was moved to put this PSA together today. I think I've spoken to you about this before, but I got pulled into veterans issues while I was very much consumed by my own active duty service while I was still captain of my submarine, USS Indianapolis. In 1998, veterans of the World War II cruiser Indianapolis pulled me into their effort to exonerate their captain, Charles Butler McVeigh, who took his own life in 1968. Now, I did a separate podcast episode on Captain McVeigh a couple of months ago. But what I was working on with those World War II heroes, I heard horror stories from many of their families about how their veteran family member returned from the war, tried to put his experience out of his mind, then suffered in silence. Many, perhaps most, suffered from PTSD, but there was essentially no treatment available to them. Many turned to alcohol, with some eventually drinking themselves to death. Seth and I have already talked about that tragedy a few times already. You would think that things would be better in 2024, but after 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're not. Veterans still suffer from severe physical and emotional problems, and the VA is inadequate to that task. It's either that their methods don't work, or they're simply not addressing the right problem, or they don't have the capacity to meet the need. The result is that, on average, 17.5 veterans a day make the decision to end their lives. That's about twice the rate of civilian suicides. But even for those veterans who aren't at risk for suicide, the transition to private life can be tough. Over the course of my civilian career, I hired hundreds of veterans, and all too often watched them fail. There were too many of them for me to counsel individually. That's why I decided to write my book on job skills for transitioning veterans. And I did some skills training for those veterans, but it didn't really work. Even that training didn't help veterans succeed because while counseling veterans, I came to see that many of them had lost their identity when they left military service. Their self-identity had been so closely connected to their military persona that when they left active duty, they began to drift. Without a stable anchor of knowing who they were, the job skills I tried to teach simply did not take hold. It essentially fell on deaf ears. I called this gap in identity the missing middle, because these veterans were missing something in themselves that caused them to be unable to find the stability necessary to succeed in other areas of their lives. That's when I decided to shift my focus from skills training to veteran ministry, because I firmly believe that Jesus Christ is the solution to that missing middle. This missing middle is a national problem, but borrowing from a slogan I learned from the environmental movement, I knew I had to think globally, but act locally. That's because While there was little I could do to solve the national problem, I'd like to think there is something I could do to address the problem locally here in Brevard County, Florida. So I got certified as a Christian chaplain and started a ministry focused on veterans, and pretty much work that issue full-time these days. So now, when I'm not working with Seth on the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, I'm working on local veterans issues focused on the ministry I named No Greater Love. I called it that after John 15:13, where Jesus says, "No one has greater love than this, to lay down his life for his friends." Many veterans know someone who laid down his life for his friends. I know some of those people too. So I pray that the name No Greater Love is an appropriate name for my ministry. The reason I'm talking to you all about this today is that a few days ago, a young wife of a local former Marine reached out to me to get help for her husband, who had deployed twice to Iraq. I was surprised to learn that she found me through this podcast when someone referred her to the episode Seth and I did about Filipino scouts. It turns out her great-grandfather was one of those scouts, and somehow she figured out that I was local and involved in this ministry. So she connected her husband with me, hoping to bring him into the ministry. That confluence of issues, her connecting the Filipino scouts to my podcast, to me and my ministry, could not have been a coincidence. I see God's hand in that. So I figured if people are finding my ministry through the podcast accidentally, then maybe I should do something to help folks make the connection intentionally. That's what drove me to record this PSA today. The Veterans Ministry, No Greater Love, meets every Monday night at 6:30 p.m. at the church at Viera in Viera, Florida. I'm there every Monday night. If you're active duty, reserves, or a veteran, or the spouse of active duty reserves or a veteran, or you know someone who fits into one of those categories who is local to Brevard County, Florida, please let them know about this ministry. They can register online to take part at churchatviera.com/military. But the meetings are in person each week here in Viera, Florida. Now, Viera is spelled V-I-E-R-A. V-I-E-R-A. So that web address again is church@viera.com. It's the word at, not the at symbol. church@viera.com/military. And for those of you watching online on YouTube, I'll show the link below. Please help me get the word out to active duty folks and veterans in need in and around Brevard County, Florida. And I wish you all the peace and blessings of Christ. I will see you again on the podcast. Captain Toti, out.